Mike Tyson wasn't looking for trouble that afternoon. He was just walking home from the gym, his hoodie pulled up, earbuds in, lost in his own world. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet street, and for once, everything felt calm. But then he saw her. An elderly woman, frail and slow, struggled with her grocery bags as she made her way down the sidewalk. Just a few steps behind her, him. A towering man, muscles straining against his tight jacket, moving in too close, too fast. His eyes were locked onto her purse, his intentions obvious even before he acted. Mike came to a halt. This wasn't happening. Not here. Not on his watch. Because even the toughest man in the world knows when it's time to step in, and Mike Tyson wasn't about to let this slide. It had been a long day at the gym. Dressed in a gray hoodie and sweatpants, Mike Tyson felt the familiar soreness in his muscles as he strolled down the quiet street. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. His earbuds pumped a steady rhythm, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about dinner, maybe a hot shower. Nothing out of the ordinary. The neighborhood was calm, wrapped in the kind of peaceful silence that comes just before dusk. Mike appreciated moments like this. They gave him space to breathe, a break from the noise and chaos of the world. But peace, he had learned, was fragile. And in an instant, it could shatter. And that's exactly what happened when he saw her. Mike Tyson had always found comfort in routine. After years in the ring, discipline was second nature to him. Every punch, every step, every breath followed a rhythm. But outside the gym, life had its own rhythm, and that's what Mike appreciated on days like this. The streets were quiet, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The air was cool but comfortable, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the urban tang of asphalt. Mike's earbuds pumped out a steady beat, but his mind wasn't on the music. He was just enjoying the stillness, the rare moments where his world felt simple and undisturbed. But the thing about peace? It never lasted. As Mike rounded a corner, his eyes instinctively scanned the street ahead. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. Years of navigating both the ring and the streets had sharpened his awareness, teaching him to notice the small things others overlooked. That's when he saw her. A frail, elderly woman, her back slightly hunched from age, was making her slow way down the sidewalk. She held two heavy grocery bags, the kind of plastic ones that cut into your fingers if you held them too long. Her steps were careful, deliberate, as if the weight of those bags was more than just physical. Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't the woman that set off alarms in his mind, it was the space around her. Something about the scene didn't sit right. A few steps behind her, moving just a little too close for comfort, was a man. Not just any man. He was big. Not as big as Mike, but enough to make most people nervous. His muscles bulged beneath a tight black jacket, the kind of build that spoke of hours spent lifting weights for size, not speed. His head was shaved, his jaw clenched, and his eyes. His eyes were locked on the woman's purse. Mike's breath slowed. He pulled out one earbud, letting the city's sounds filter in. The distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, it all faded as he zeroed in on the subtle cues in front of him. The way the man's hands flexed and unflexed, the tension in his shoulders, the slight quickening of his pace. Mike knew that posture. He'd seen it in the ring, in the streets. The man was coiled like a spring, ready to snap. And Mike was ready to catch him. In the ring, you learn to read your opponent before the first punch was even thrown. Their stance, their eyes, the way they breathed, it all told a story. This was no different. The woman had no idea she was being targeted. She was too focused on balancing her groceries, her frail hands tightening around the straps of her purse as if she sensed, on some level, that something was off. But sensing danger and seeing it were two different things. Mike's muscles tensed, but he didn't rush. Timing was everything. If you moved too soon, you'd miss the chance to stop it. Too late, and someone got hurt. He slowed his steps, letting the distance between him and the pair close naturally. His mind shifted gears, slipping into the calm, focused state that had made him a champion. The woman reached the corner, pausing briefly to adjust one of the grocery bags that had started to slip from her grasp. She didn't see the man behind her speeding up, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. Mike could almost hear the man's thoughts, "Now's the time." The man moved fast, faster than Mike expected for someone his size. He grabbed for the woman's purse, yanking it hard, the sudden motion pulling the frail woman off balance. She let out a sharp, startled cry, stumbling backward as her groceries spilled across the sidewalk, apples rolling into the gutter, a carton of eggs cracking open with a soft splatter against the pavement. But she didn't let go. Her hands, frail and trembling, gripped that purse with a strength born from pure, stubborn determination. But it wasn't enough. The man's muscles rippled as he yanked harder, trying to tear it from her grasp. Mike didn't hesitate. As the man struggled with the woman, Mike's pace didn't quicken. He didn't need to rush. The calm, confident steps of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of echoed against the concrete. His shadow stretched long in the fading light, merging with the chaos ahead. The man hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on his target. But Mike was close enough now that his voice didn't need to be loud to be heard. "Hey," Mike said, his tone low, steady, but carrying the kind of weight that made people stop in their tracks. The man froze, his head snapping around to see who had spoken. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Mike, his brain trying to process the sight before him. Mike Tyson wasn't just any man. And you didn't need to be a boxing fan to recognize the face, or the presence, of one of the most feared fighters in history. For a split second, the man's bravado wavered. His eyes darted from Mike's face to his fists, those legendary fists that had knocked out giants in the ring. He was sizing him up, trying to figure out if he could take him, if this was a fight he wanted. But Mike didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared, his posture relaxed but radiating a quiet, unmistakable threat. "You don't want to do this," Mike said softly, almost like he was giving the man a choice. But his eyes told a different story. There was no choice. The man's chest heaved as he weighed his options. But fear was a powerful motivator, and it didn't take long for him to make the only decision that made sense. He let go of the purse, his hands raising slightly in a gesture that was part surrender, part self-preservation. "Hey, man," the guy muttered, backing away slowly. "I don't want no trouble." Mike didn't move. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. The man took one last look at Mike, realized he was outmatched in every possible way, and turned, bolting down the street like his life depended on it. As the man disappeared around the corner, the street fell silent again, but the energy had shifted. The elderly woman stood there, still clutching her purse, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her groceries lay scattered around her, a silent testament to what had almost happened. Mike exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady, his mind already shifting from defense to comfort. Because the threat was gone. But his job wasn't done. The street was deceptively calm. The kind of quiet that settled just before something went wrong. Mike Tyson had felt it 1,000 times before, the eerie silence before the first punch in the ring, the sharp inhale of a crowd before a knockout blow. But this wasn't a ring. This was real life. And what was about to happen couldn't be stopped by a referee. The elderly woman shuffled forward, her grocery bags swaying with each shaky step. She paused briefly at the corner, setting one bag down to adjust the strap of her purse, oblivious to the danger creeping closer behind her. Mike's eyes never left the man. The tension in his broad shoulders, the flex of his fingers, the slight forward lean of his body, it was all there. The man was coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. And Mike knew exactly when it would happen. Mike's mind worked like a machine, cataloging every detail. the man's right foot stepping slightly ahead, signaling he was about to lunge. His eyes darting around quickly, checking for witnesses. The tightening grip on his jacket sleeve, preparing for a swift grab. It was all too familiar. The man thought he was in control. He thought he was bigger, faster, stronger than the fragile woman in front of him. But he hadn't noticed Mike. Not yet. Mike let the distance between them close naturally, his steps measured, his breathing steady. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. The elderly woman had no idea of the danger behind her. She was lost in her own world, probably thinking about getting home, maybe worried about what she'd cook for dinner, or how much longer her legs would hold up under the weight of the groceries. Her purse hung loosely over her shoulder, the strap thin and worn, the kind that would snap easily if pulled hard enough. Mike's heart tightened. She didn't deserve this. Nobody did. But life didn't care about fairness. And neither did the man creeping up behind her. The man moved fast. With one quick, aggressive motion, he grabbed the woman's purse strap and yanked hard. The sudden force jerked her body backward, her fragile frame stumbling as the weight of the pull knocked her off balance. Her groceries tumbled to the ground, an apple rolling into the gutter, a loaf of bread splitting open as it hit the pavement, eggs cracking in a slow, sad spill of yolk and shell. But the woman didn't let go. Her knuckles turned white as she clung to her purse, a mix of fear and stubborn defiance etched across her wrinkled face. Her lips parted in a sharp gasp, followed by a trembling, "Let go." But her voice, frail and shaky, didn't carry enough weight to stop the man. Mike's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from focus. Mike didn't sprint forward. He didn't yell or cause a scene. Years of fighting had taught him that rushing in wasn't always the best move. Precision mattered. Timing mattered. He took a slow, steady step toward them, his shadow growing larger in the fading evening light. The sound of his footfalls against the pavement was soft, but somehow it echoed louder in his mind. The man still hadn't noticed him. He was too busy wrestling with the purse, his face contorted in frustration as the woman refused to let go. Mike was close now, close enough to see the sweat starting to bead on the man's forehead, the way his jaw clenched tighter with each failed attempt to rip the purse free. In that split second, Mike made a decision. He could end this in one move. A single punch would drop the man where he stood. But Mike knew better. This wasn't about showing off his strength. It was about sending a message without violence. Violence was easy. Control was harder. Mike's voice cut through the tension like a knife slicing through silk. "Hey." Just one word, but it carried the weight of 1,000. The man froze. His hands still gripping the purse strap, his body tensed mid-pull. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes widening as they landed on Mike. Recognition flickered across his face, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, fear. Because standing just a few feet away from him was Mike Tyson. The man's bravado evaporated in an instant. Whatever confidence he'd had, whatever plan he'd thought would work, it crumbled under the sheer presence of the heavyweight champion standing before him. Mike didn't need to raise his fists. He didn't need to shout. His calm, steady gaze was enough. "You don't want to do this," Mike said quietly, his tone firm but not threatening. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. The man's eyes darted from Mike's face to his hands, those legendary fists that had flattened giants in the ring. The reality of the situation sank in, fast and hard. The man's grip on the purse slackened. His hands trembled slightly as he slowly released the strap, raising his palms in a gesture of surrender. "Hey, man," he muttered, backing away, his voice shaky. "I don't want no trouble." Mike didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched as the man stumbled backward, his tough guy facade crumbling with every step. When the man finally turned and bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows, Mike let out a slow, measured breath. But his focus shifted immediately. The threat was gone. But the woman still needed him. Mike stepped closer to the elderly woman, who was still clutching her purse to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling from the adrenaline coursing through her fragile frame. "You okay, ma'am?" Mike asked softly, his voice losing its edge and replacing it with warmth. The woman looked up at him, her eyes scanning his face, trying to process what had just happened. Recognition dawned slowly, and when it did, her expression shifted from fear to awe, and then to gratitude. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Mike gave her a small, reassuring smile, kneeling down to gather her scattered groceries. "Don't worry about that," he said, placing the bruised apples back in the bag. "You're safe now." And in that moment, Mike Tyson wasn't the heavyweight champion of the world. He was just a man who saw someone in need and stepped in when it mattered most. Mike Tyson wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to be noticed. His presence alone carried weight, the kind of silent authority that made people pause, that made them think twice before doing something stupid. As he approached the unfolding scene, his shadow stretched long over the sidewalk, merging with the chaos in front of him. The tension in the air felt thick, like the moments before a fight bell rang, but this wasn't a sanctioned match, this was real life, and there were no rules to protect the vulnerable. Mike didn't rush. He didn't need to. He knew the effect his calm, measured steps would have. The confidence in his stride wasn't arrogance, it was experience. He'd been in more fights than he could count, but the battles outside the ring? Those were the ones that mattered most. The would-be mugger still had his thick hands wrapped around the elderly woman's purse, his muscles straining as he tried to rip it free from her surprisingly strong grip. But the second Mike's voice cut through the tension, the man froze mid-pull. "Hey!" It wasn't loud, but it hit like a punch to the gut. The man's head snapped around, his eyes locking onto Mike's. There was a beat of silence, a flicker of disbelief, as if his brain couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Standing just a few feet away from him was Mike Tyson. The man's bravado faltered, his posture shifting from aggressive to defensive in an instant. At first, the man tried to mask his fear. His chest puffed out slightly, his jaw clenched tighter, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked down to Mike's fists, those legendary fists that had flattened champions and turned giants into dust. "You don't want to do this," Mike said, his voice low and steady, like he was offering advice rather than issuing a threat. The man's bravado cracked a little more. He took a half-step back, his eyes darting from Mike to the woman, as if trying to calculate whether this was a fight he could win. But deep down, he already knew the answer. The power dynamic had flipped completely. A moment ago, the man had been the predator, confident in his size and strength as he targeted someone weaker. But now he was the one being sized up, and the realization hit him like a freight train. Mike didn't move. He didn't have to. His calm, unflinching gaze was more effective than any punch could have been. The man could feel the weight of that stare, the unspoken message behind it, "You've got one chance to walk away." And the man wasn't stupid enough to miss it. With a sharp, frustrated grunt, the man let go of the purse strap. His hands hovered in the air for a split second, like he wanted to pretend he wasn't scared, but the tremble in his fingers gave him away. "Hey, man," he muttered, his voice shaky, "I don't want no trouble." Mike's expression didn't change. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. He just watched, his silence more intimidating than any threat. The man took another step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Mike's as he slowly retreated down the sidewalk. And then, like a switch flipped, the man turned and ran. His bulky frame, so confident and menacing just moments before, now looked clumsy as he bolted down the street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. He didn't look back. He didn't dare look back. Mike stood still, watching until the man disappeared around the corner. The street fell silent again, but the tension lingered in the air, like the aftershock of a distant thunderclap. Only when the threat was completely gone did Mike shift his focus to the elderly woman. She was still clutching her purse to her chest, her knuckles white from the strain. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, her face pale but her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't processed what had just happened, not fully. "You all right, ma'am?" Mike asked gently, his voice softening as he approached her. The woman looked up, her eyes scanning his face. There was a flicker of recognition, maybe she'd seen him on TV, maybe she'd heard his name in passing, but right now, none of that mattered. All she saw was the man who had stopped her from being hurt. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced down at her groceries scattered across the sidewalk, the smashed eggs, the bruised fruit. Then her eyes lifted back to Mike's, filling with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Mike gave her a small, reassuring smile and knelt down to gather her groceries. The plastic bags had torn, but he carefully placed the salvageable items back together, handling each item with the same care he used to train for a fight. "Don't worry about that," he said, standing up and offering her the bags. "You're safe now." But Mike wasn't finished. "Let me walk you home," he said, his tone gentle but firm, leaving no room for refusal. The woman hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her common sense. But the kindness in Mike's eyes, the steady reassurance in his voice, made her nod slowly. "I'd like that," she whispered. So, they started down the street together, Mike carrying her bags as they walked side by side. As they walked, the woman shared snippets of her life, a widow living alone, her children grown and moved away, the city feeling less safe than it used to. Mike listened quietly, his heart heavy with the understanding that sometimes, it wasn't just about the physical dangers people faced, it was about the loneliness, the vulnerability that crept in when no one was watching. When they reached her small apartment building, Mike helped her up the steps, setting the groceries down inside her door. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Mike just smiled, his voice warm and sincere. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just take care of yourself." And with that, he turned and walked back into the fading light of the evening, leaving behind not just a saved purse, but a reminder that strength isn't just about fists and muscle. It's about showing up when it counts. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The would-be mugger, still frozen mid-motion, stared into the eyes of Mike Tyson. The disbelief on his face was almost comical. He'd gone from predator to prey in a matter of seconds, and his brain was struggling to catch up. Mike, on the other hand, was the picture of calm. He didn't need to clench his fists or take a fighting stance. His mere presence was enough to shift the balance of power. The street had been the mugger's arena, but now it belonged to Mike. The man's bravado, which had puffed up his chest and stiffened his jaw just moments before, began to crack. The tension in his muscles loosened as the reality of the situation sank in. The mugger's eyes darted from Mike's face to his hands, those infamous fists that had knocked out legends in the blink of an eye. His brain raced, calculating whether he could still salvage the situation. Maybe if he moved fast enough, maybe if he caught Mike off guard. But the thought fizzled out as quickly as it came. Because deep down, the man knew the truth. This wasn't a fight he could win. Mike's gaze remained steady, unblinking. He didn't need to raise his voice or threaten violence. His eyes told the story of every opponent who had underestimated him, every fighter who thought they had a chance until they felt the thunder of his fists. "You don't want to do this," Mike said again, his voice low and calm, almost like he was offering the man advice. But there was no room for misunderstanding. The message was clear: walk away while you still can. The mugger's hands twitched, his fingers loosening their grip on the elderly woman's purse. The tension drained from his body, replaced by something else: fear. The kind of fear that seeps into your bones and you realize you're outmatched in every way. With a frustrated grunt, the man let go of the purse completely. He raised his hand slightly, a universal gesture of surrender, but his eyes still flickered with residual defiance, like a cornered animal trying to hold on to the last shred of its pride. "Hey, man," he muttered, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound tough. "I don't want no trouble." Mike didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any words could have been. The man took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Mike's face. The tension in his body had shifted from aggression to self-preservation. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he hesitated, as if he still couldn't believe how quickly the tables had turned. But when Mike took a slow, deliberate step forward, the mugger's resolve crumbled completely. Without another word, the man turned and bolted down the street. His heavy boots slapped against the pavement, echoing in the quiet evening air. His broad shoulders hunched as he sprinted, his earlier confidence now nothing more than a fading memory. Mike watched him go, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. He didn't chase after him. He didn't need to. The man had already lost more than just the fight, he'd lost his dignity. As the mugger disappeared around the corner, the street slowly returned to its earlier stillness. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet. This silence was heavier, charged with the aftermath of what had almost happened. The elderly woman stood frozen, her purse clutched tightly to her chest, her body trembling slightly. The groceries she had dropped were scattered across the sidewalk, apples rolling into the gutter, a carton of eggs leaking yellow onto the pavement, a loaf of bread torn open and dusted with dirt. But she was safe. And that was all that mattered. Mike's focus shifted immediately. The threat was gone, but the woman still needed him. His posture softened as he approached her, the tension in his muscles easing but his awareness still sharp. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked gently, his voice losing the edge it had carried moments before. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she didn't respond, as if her mind was still processing the whirlwind of events. But then recognition dawned on her face, not just recognition of who Mike was, but recognition of what he had done. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling as much as her hands. Her grip on her purse loosened slightly, and her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from overwhelming gratitude. Mike gave her a small, reassuring smile, the kind that said, "You're safe now. It's over." She looked down at her groceries scattered across the pavement and let out a soft, shaky laugh, the kind that comes when the adrenaline starts to fade, and reality sets back in. "My eggs," she murmured, her voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mike chuckled softly, the tension easing further. "Don't worry about the eggs," he said, kneeling down to start picking up the fallen groceries. Mike moved carefully, gathering the bruised apples and torn bread with surprising gentleness. The heavyweight champion, whose fists had toppled giants, now handled each item with the same care he'd give to something fragile and precious. The woman watched him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She still couldn't believe it. Mike Tyson, of all people, had been the one to step in, to save her from what could have been a terrifying ordeal. As Mike handed her the salvaged groceries, she reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Mike met her gaze, his eyes warm and sincere. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" And in that moment, the line between legend and man blurred. Mike Tyson wasn't just a fighter, wasn't just a name etched into boxing history. He was a protector. And sometimes, the greatest fights weren't in the ring, they were the ones where no punches needed to be thrown at all. Mike didn't just leave the woman standing there. After gathering her groceries, he gently took the bags from her fragile hands and offered to walk her home. She hesitated for a moment, pride flickering across her face, but the kindness in Mike's eyes made it impossible to refuse. As they walked side by side down the quiet street, the woman spoke in a soft, trembling voice. She shared bits of her life, how she'd lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, how things had changed, how the city didn't feel as safe anymore. Mike listened quietly, nodding, offering the occasional reassuring word. When they reached her small apartment building, Mike carried the bags up the steps and set them inside her door. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Mike gave her a small smile, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just take care of yourself." As Mike Tyson walked back down the street, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He'd spent his life fighting battles in the ring, proving his strength to the world. But this was the kind of strength that mattered most. Because real power isn't just about knocking someone out, it's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And for Mike Tyson, being a champion wasn't just about titles. It was about showing up when it mattered most.